in the summer of 356 years before the Common Era, in the ancient city of Pella, capital of the Kingdom of Macedon, a child was born who would reshape the world. The date was the 20th of July, and according to legend, on that very day, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the world, burned to the ground. Ancient writers would later claim that the goddess Artemis had been too preoccupied with attending this momentous birth to protect her own temple. The child was named Alexander, and he was destined to become the greatest conqueror the ancient world had ever known. To understand the magnitude of what Alexander would achieve, we must first understand the world into which he was born. The Mediterranean and Near Eastern world of the 4th century before the Common Era was a tapestry of competing powers, ancient civilizations, and emerging kingdoms. In the south, Egypt had already existed for millennia, its pyramids already ancient monuments to a golden age long past. The Nile Valley remained a land of mystery and wealth, ruled by Persian overlords who had conquered it 2 centuries earlier. To the east stretched the vast Persian Empire, the Achaemenid dynasty, that had dominated the known world for more than 200 years. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the borders of India, from the burning deserts of Arabia to the snow-capped mountains of the Caucasus, the great king of Persia commanded millions of subjects speaking hundreds of languages. The Persian Empire represented a level of administrative sophistication and cultural diversity that seemed almost incomprehensible to the Greeks. Its royal roads stretched thousands of miles, allowing messages to travel with unprecedented speed across continents. Its capitals, Persepolis, Susa, and Babylon, were centers of unimaginable wealth and splendor. The great king ruled not as a mere monarch, but as the king of kings, commanding the loyalty of satraps, who themselves ruled territories larger than most Greek kingdoms. Yet, for all its grandeur, the Persian Empire was not invincible. 2 centuries earlier, Greek city-states had repelled Persian invasions, first at Marathon, then at Salamis and Plataea. These victories had become foundational myths for Greek identity, stories of how free citizens fighting for their homeland could defeat the numberless hordes of Eastern despotism. But the Greek world of the 4th century was a fractured place. Dozens of independent city-states, each fiercely proud of its autonomy, dotted the landscape of the Greek peninsula and the shores of the Aegean Sea. Athens, once the greatest of these cities, had been humbled by defeat in the Peloponnesian War against Sparta. Sparta itself had proven incapable of maintaining the hegemony it had won. Thebes had its moment of dominance, but like Athens and Sparta before it, could not unite the fractious Greeks under a lasting leadership. These city-states fought endless wars among themselves, their energies dissipated in petty conflicts, while the great powers of Persia and Egypt looked on with amusement or indifference. To the north of these squabbling Greek cities lay Macedonia, a kingdom that most Greeks did not even consider truly Greek. The Macedonians spoke a dialect of Greek that Southerners found crude and barely comprehensible. They lived under kings rather than as democratic citizens, and their society retained a feudal character that seemed primitive to the sophisticated Athenians. The Macedonian nobility were hard-drinking warriors who hunted in dangerous forests and fought constant battles with barbarian tribes on their northern frontiers. Their capital, Pella, was a provincial town by Athenian standards, lacking the architectural splendors and intellectual vibrancy of the great southern cities. Yet Macedonia possessed advantages that the Greek city-states lacked. Its monarchy provided political stability and continuity of purpose. Its nobles, bound to the king by ties of personal loyalty and military service, formed a cavalry force of unmatched quality. And most importantly, Macedonia had in Philip II a king of extraordinary vision and ability. Philip had become king in 359, inheriting a kingdom in crisis. Barbarian tribes pressed from the north, Greek cities threatened from the south, and pretenders challenged his claim to the throne. Through 2 decades of patient military reform, diplomatic maneuvering, and ruthless warfare, Philip had transformed Macedonia from a backward frontier kingdom into the dominant power of northern Greece. He had revolutionized warfare itself, creating the phalanx, a dense formation of infantry armed with the sarissa, a spear 18 feet long that gave Macedonian foot soldiers a devastating advantage over traditionally armed Greeks. He had trained his army to a level of discipline and professionalism unknown in the citizen militias of the south. He had conquered gold mines that provided the wealth to sustain a permanent military force. And he had married repeatedly, each marriage a diplomatic alliance that expanded his power and influence. The relationship between Philip and Olympias was complex and often tense. Philip's polygamy was not unusual for a Macedonian king, but Olympias clearly resented sharing her husband with other wives and watching her position at court fluctuate with her husband's political calculations. She was ambitious for her son, determined that Alexander, not some child by another wife, would inherit the throne. This maternal ambition would shape the course of Alexander's early life and, some would later claim, play a role in the violent events that brought him to power. For now, though, in the summer of 356, she was simply a mother holding her newborn son, perhaps already dreaming of the greatness that awaited him. The birth was accompanied by auspicious signs and victories that seemed to augur a glorious future. On the same day that Alexander was born, Philip received news of 3 separate triumphs. His general Parmenion had won a great victory over the Illyrians, traditional enemies on Macedonia's northern frontier. His horses had won at the Olympic Games, bringing glory to the Macedonian name in the heart of the Greek world. And Philip himself was conducting a successful siege at Potidaea, a strategic city on the Chalcidice Peninsula. Ancient writers, with their love of portents and prophecies, saw in this convergence of events the hand of fate. A child born on such a day of triumph, they reasoned, must be destined for unprecedented glory. Alexander's early childhood was spent in the royal palace at Pella, a world of intrigue, ambition, and barely concealed violence. The Macedonian court was not a refined place by Greek standards. The nobility gathered in the great hall to feast and drink wine, often to excess. They told stories of battles and hunts, displayed their scars, and competed for honor and the king's favor. Women, even royal women like Olympias, lived in separate quarters and had limited formal power, but they wielded considerable informal influence through their sons and their networks of alliances and enmities. Alexander grew up hearing tales of heroic ancestors, learning that a king must be first among warriors, that courage and martial prowess were the highest virtues, that glory won in battle was the only immortality that truly mattered. His mother told him other stories as well. She spoke of his descent from Achilles through her father's line and from Heracles through Philip's ancestry. She imbued him with a sense of divine destiny, teaching him that he was no ordinary child, but someone marked by the gods for extraordinary deeds. Whether she actually told Alexander that his true father was not Philip but Zeus himself, as some ancient sources claim, is impossible to know with certainty. What is clear is that Alexander grew up believing himself to be special, chosen, destined for greatness that transcended normal human limitations. This conviction would drive him throughout his life, pushing him to attempt what others thought impossible and to endure hardships that would have broken lesser men. Despite Olympias's dominant role in his early education, Alexander did not spend all his time with his mother. He had tutors who taught him the basics of reading, writing, and music. One of these early teachers was a man named Leonidas, a relative of Olympias who ran the young prince's household with Spartan severity. Leonidas believed in hardship as the forge of character. He supervised Alexander's diet carefully, ensuring the boy did not grow soft with luxury. He led Alexander on long marches in the sun to toughen him. He inspected the prince's belongings to make sure no one had secretly provided him with delicacies or comforts that might weaken his spirit. Another tutor, Lysimachus, took a different approach. He encouraged Alexander to imagine himself as the heroes of legend, particularly Achilles, and through this imaginative play, instilled in the young prince the values and aspirations of the heroic ideal. Philip was often absent, leading his armies on campaign, but when he was present, he involved Alexander in the serious business of kingship. Alexander attended council meetings where Philip consulted with his generals and nobles. He watched his father manage the complex diplomacy required to maintain Macedonia's position among hostile neighbors and suspicious Greek cities. He learned that power required not just military strength, but also political cunning, the ability to forge alliances, to know when to fight and when to negotiate, to understand what motivated other men and how to use that understanding to achieve one's goals. Philip's example taught Alexander that a king must be simultaneously a warrior, a diplomat, a judge, and a leader of men. It was an education in practical statecraft that no philosopher could have provided. For 3 years, from the ages of 13 to 16, Alexander studied with Aristotle. The curriculum was comprehensive, covering ethics and politics, natural philosophy and metaphysics, rhetoric and poetry, medicine and biology. Aristotle believed that education should develop the whole person, cultivating both intellectual virtues and moral character. He taught Alexander to observe carefully, to question assumptions, to seek rational explanations for phenomena rather than accepting myth and superstition uncritically. He introduced the young prince to the great works of Greek literature, poetry, and drama. Most significantly for Alexander's future, Aristotle gave him a special edited version of Homer's Iliad, a text that Alexander would carry with him throughout his conquests and that would profoundly shape his understanding of heroism, honor, and the quest for eternal glory. The relationship between the philosopher and the prince was complex. Aristotle represented the Greek ideal of reason, moderation, and the examined life. He taught that the highest happiness came from intellectual contemplation, and that the truly virtuous man exercised rational control over his passions. Alexander, by contrast, was fundamentally a man of action and passion. He absorbed Aristotle's teachings eagerly, and they would influence his thinking throughout his life. But his nature was romantic and impulsive, where Aristotle's was analytical and measured. The philosopher taught that non-Greeks, whom the Greeks called barbarians, were naturally inferior and suited only for slavery. Alexander would later reject this teaching entirely, seeking instead to blend Greek and Persian cultures and treating conquered peoples with a respect that would scandalize many of his Macedonian companions. Beyond formal philosophy, Aristotle encouraged Alexander's interest in science, particularly medicine and botany. Alexander would later include scientists and botanists in his army during his campaigns, sending back specimens and reports to Aristotle. This scientific curiosity was unusual for a military commander and reflected the breadth of Alexander's intellectual interests. He was not merely a soldier, but a man who wanted to understand the world, to push back the boundaries of geographical knowledge, to document and study the strange peoples and lands he would encounter. In this sense, his conquests were not just military expeditions, but also voyages of discovery, an attempt to reach the ends of the earth and to bring back knowledge of what lay beyond the familiar Greek world. Alexander was not the only student at Macedonia. Aristotle taught several young Macedonian nobles who would become Alexander's lifelong companions and officers. Among them was Hephaestion, who would become Alexander's closest friend, a relationship so intense that ancient and modern writers have debated its nature. Was it a romantic attachment, as some sources suggest, or simply the profound bond between warriors who had grown up together? In the context of ancient Greek culture, where passionate friendships between men were common and respected, the question may be anachronistic. What matters is that Hephaestion became Alexander's alter ego, the person he trusted above all others, whose death would later devastate him beyond measure. Other companions from these years included Ptolemy, who would later become king of Egypt and write a history of Alexander's campaigns, Nearchus, who would command Alexander's fleet, and Cassander, whose relationship with Alexander would be far more troubled. As Alexander approached manhood, events began moving rapidly. At 16, his formal education with Aristotle ended, and he was given his first taste of real military command. In 340, while Philip was besieging the city of Byzantium far to the east, Alexander was left in charge of Macedonia as regent. When a Thracian tribe, the Maedi, took advantage of Philip's absence to attack Macedonian territory, the 16-year-old prince led an army against them, defeated them, and established a military colony on their land, naming it Alexandropolis after himself. It was his first independent military command, and it demonstrated both his courage and his capability. 2 years later, at 18, Alexander commanded the cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea, the decisive engagement where Philip finally established Macedonian dominance over the Greek city-states. The allied forces of Athens and Thebes met Philip's army on an August day in 338 on a plain near the town of Chaeronea. The battle was hard fought, with both sides committed to total victory or total defeat. The Thebans fought with particular desperation, knowing that defeat would mean the end of their city's independence. Their elite force, the Sacred Band, 300 warriors bound by ties of love and honor to fight together to the death, held the center of their line. It was against this formidable unit that Alexander led his cavalry charge. Ancient sources describe how the young prince personally led the attack that broke. But the triumph at Chaeronea also marked the beginning of a period of crisis in the relationship between Alexander and his father. Philip had united most of Greece under Macedonian leadership through the League of Corinth, with only Sparta holding aloof. He had been elected commander of a planned invasion of the Persian Empire, a crusade of vengeance for the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier. His position seemed unassailable, his achievements remarkable, his ambitions on the verge of fulfillment. Perhaps it was this very success that led to the events that would tear his family apart. Philip took a new wife, a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. Unlike Olympias and Philip's other wives, who came from foreign royal families, Cleopatra was from the Macedonian nobility, and her family had powerful connections at court. Her uncle, Attalus, was one of Philip's leading generals. The marriage itself was a political and personal crisis for Olympias and Alexander. At the wedding feast, Attalus, drunk on wine, called upon the guests to pray that the marriage would produce a legitimate heir to the throne. The clear implication was that Alexander, son of a foreign woman from Epirus, was somehow less legitimate than any child born to a native Macedonian mother would be. Alexander, outraged, hurled his cup at Attalus and demanded to know if Attalus was calling him a bastard. Philip, also drunk, rose from his couch and drew his sword, apparently intending to attack his own son. But the king had drunk too much, and his legs betrayed him. He stumbled and fell, collapsing on the floor before he could reach Alexander. Alexander, looking down at his father sprawled ignominiously, said bitterly that here was a man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, but who could not even cross from one couch to another. After this humiliating scene, Alexander and Olympias left Macedonia. They went first to Epirus, to the court of Olympias's brother Alexander, who was king there. Alexander the prince then travelled to Illyria, apparently contemplating exile or perhaps seeking allies among Philip's enemies. For a time, it seemed that the succession crisis might lead to civil war. Philip had worked too hard building his kingdom to see it destroyed by a family quarrel, and eventually intermediaries arranged a reconciliation. Alexander returned to Pella, but the relationship between father and son remained strained. Alexander's position as heir seemed less secure than before, especially when it became clear that Cleopatra was pregnant. If she bore a son, that child would have powerful supporters who would argue for his claim to the throne over Alexander's. The crisis deepened when Philip attempted to arrange a marriage between Alexander's half-brother Arrhidaeus and the daughter of Pixodarus, the satrap of Caria in Asia Minor. Arrhidaeus was Philip's son by another wife, Philina, and he appears to have been mentally disabled, possibly due to poisoning, though ancient sources are unclear on this point. Olympias and some of Alexander's friends convinced the prince that this marriage proposal meant Philip intended to make Arrhidaeus his heir, passing over Alexander entirely. In a panic, Alexander sent a messenger to Pixodarus, suggesting that the satrap should offer his daughter to Alexander himself, rather than to Arrhidaeus. When Philip learned of this unauthorized diplomatic initiative, he was furious. He came to Alexander's quarters and berated him for attempting to marry the daughter of a mere satrap, a Carian who was himself the slave of a barbarian king. Philip wanted a far more prestigious match for Alexander, if indeed Alexander remained his heir. The king exiled 4 of Alexander's closest friends, Harpalus, Nearchus, Ptolemy, and Erigaius, apparently considering them bad influences on the prince. The crisis demonstrated how uncertain Alexander's future had become and how easily the years of preparation and achievement could be swept away by royal displeasure. The resolution came suddenly and violently. In the autumn of 336, Philip arranged a grand celebration for the marriage of his daughter, also named Cleopatra, to her uncle Alexander of Epirus, Olympias's brother. This marriage was meant to cement the alliance between Macedonia and Epirus, possibly as a gesture of reconciliation toward Olympias. The wedding was held at Aegae, the old capital of Macedonia, with all the splendor Philip could command. Delegations from Greek cities attended, bringing golden crowns and congratulations. The festival included athletic competitions and theatrical performances. On the morning after the wedding ceremony, Philip planned to enter the theatre at dawn to sacrifice to the gods. He wanted to display himself to the assembled Greeks as their leader and the champion of Hellenism. He dismissed his bodyguards, wanting to appear accessible and confident, protected by the goodwill of those present rather than by armed guards. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Suspicion fell on several possible conspirators. Had Pausanias acted alone, driven by personal resentment? Or had he been part of a larger plot? Some suspected Persian gold, reasoning that the great king of Persia would have every reason to arrange the death of the man planning to invade his empire. Others whispered about Olympias and Alexander, noting that both had strong motives to remove Philip. Alexander's succession had seemed uncertain. Philip's death made Alexander king immediately, acclaimed by the army, while his father's body was still warm. Olympias had been humiliated by Philip's last marriage and his apparent preference for Cleopatra Eurydice over her. Both mother and son benefited immensely from Philip's death. Whether they had any actual involvement remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. What is certain is that Olympias acted quickly and ruthlessly once Philip was dead. She had Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant daughter murdered, forcing Cleopatra to hang herself after witnessing her child's death. Alexander may have been furious at his mother's excessive brutality, but he did not punish her for it. At 20 years old, Alexander found himself king of Macedonia and commander of the forces assembled for the invasion of Persia. But his position was far from secure. The Greek cities, which had submitted to Philip only reluctantly, saw his death as an opportunity to regain their freedom. Barbarian tribes on Macedonia's northern frontiers, held in check by fear of Philip, prepared to test the young king. Within Macedonia itself, there were potential rivals and discontented nobles who questioned whether this untried youth could hold Philip's kingdom together, much less lead a successful invasion of the world's greatest empire. Many thought Alexander would be overwhelmed by the challenges facing him, and that Philip's achievements would dissolve in civil war and foreign invasion. Alexander's response was swift and decisive, demonstrating qualities that would characterize his entire reign. He moved immediately to secure the loyalty of the army by distributing gifts and promising to maintain Philip's policies. He sent messengers to the Greek cities, assuring them that he intended to continue his father's arrangements, but making clear that he expected their obedience. When the city of Thebes and some other cities, nevertheless, declared their independence and prepared for war, Alexander marched south with an army so quickly that the Greeks could hardly believe he had arrived. Most cities hastily renewed their allegiance. Athens, which had celebrated Philip's death openly, hoping for liberation, sent a delegation to apologize and acknowledge Alexander as the League's leader. Only Thebes remained defiant, trusting in its strong walls and military tradition. Alexander offered the Thebans terms, asking only that they surrender the leaders of the revolt. The Theban response was to launch an attack on the Macedonian forces camped outside their walls. In the battle that followed, Macedonian discipline and tactics overwhelmed Theban courage. Alexander's forces broke into the city, and what followed was one of the most controversial acts of his career. He allowed his soldiers to sack Thebes, destroying buildings, killing thousands of inhabitants, and selling the survivors into slavery. Only the temples and the house where the poet Pindar had lived were spared, a gesture toward Greek culture, even in the midst of destruction. The obliteration of Thebes was calculated terrorism, a message to any other city contemplating resistance. It worked. No Greek city challenged Alexander's authority again while he lived. The destruction haunted Alexander, and ancient writers say he later regretted his harshness. But at the time, it served its brutal purpose of securing his rear before he embarked on his great expedition. With Greece pacified and Macedonia secure, Alexander turned his attention to Persia. In the spring of 334, he crossed the Hellespont into Asia at the head of an army of approximately 35,000 Macedonians and Greeks. It was one of the most consequential military expeditions in history, a gamble that would either end in Alexander's death and the collapse of his father's kingdom, or in the conquest of the known world. The Persian Empire that Alexander faced was ancient, vast, and wealthy beyond Greek comprehension. It had been founded by Cyrus the Great 2 centuries earlier, and had at its height controlled territory from India to Egypt, from the steppes of Central Asia to the Mediterranean Sea. Its current ruler, Darius III, was a capable administrator, but not a brilliant military commander. He had inherited a throne through a series of assassinations and palace coups, and lacked the prestige and authority of the empire's founder. Fighting spirit to the Persian cause. Persian kings could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, though ancient sources invariably exaggerate these numbers. Still, even allowing for exaggeration, Persia could mobilize forces that dwarfed anything Macedonia could produce. Alexander's advantage lay not in numbers, but in the quality of his troops and the tactical innovations his father had developed. The Macedonian phalanx, armed with the long sarissa spears, provided a virtually impenetrable infantry corps. The companion cavalry, drawn from the Macedonian nobility and trained from childhood, formed an elite strike force that Alexander personally led in battle. The combination of these elements, skillfully coordinated, gave Alexander a military instrument superior to anything the Persians could field. Within days of crossing into Asia, Alexander visited the ancient site of Troy, site of the legendary war that had been the subject of Homer's Iliad. He made sacrifices at what was believed to be the tomb of Achilles, his ancestor, according to Olympias's teaching. Ancient writers say he ran naked around the tomb, following Greek athletic custom, and laid a crown on it, while his friend Hephaestion laid a crown on the tomb of Patroclus, Achilles' companion. The message was clear. Alexander saw himself as a new Achilles, come to win glory and revenge in Asia, to exceed even the legendary deeds of the heroes of old. This was not merely propaganda. Alexander seems genuinely to have believed in his connection to Achilles and to have modeled his behavior on the Homeric hero throughout his life. Like Achilles, Alexander would choose a short life of glory over a long life of obscurity. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor, governors of the western provinces of the empire, did not wait for Darius to lead the response to the Macedonian invasion. They gathered their own forces and took up a defensive position along the Granicus River, intending to stop Alexander at the boundary of the satrapies they governed. In May of 334, the two armies met at the Granicus in northwestern Anatolia, near the road to the Phrygian capital. The Persians had positioned themselves cleverly. Their cavalry lined the eastern bank of the river, which was swollen with spring snowmelt and had steep, muddy banks. Their Greek mercenary infantry formed a second line behind the cavalry. The position seemed strong. Any force attempting to cross the river would be at terrible disadvantage, struggling up muddy banks while being struck from above. Alexander's generals, particularly the experienced Parmenion, counseled caution. They suggested waiting, perhaps making camp and crossing the next day or looking for a better crossing point. Alexander rejected this advice. He knew that hesitation would encourage the Persians and discourage his own men. He needed a decisive victory immediately to establish his reputation and to secure his foothold in Asia. Moreover, the Persians expected him to be cautious, to follow the sensible military advice to avoid battle under disadvantageous conditions. By attacking immediately, Alexander would surprise them and seize the initiative. He ordered his cavalry to ford the river, personally leading the charge. The scene must have been extraordinary. The young king in his distinctive armor, white plumes marking him as the commander, urging his horse into the rushing water, while javelins and arrows rained down from the Persian cavalry on the opposite bank. The initial assault was brutal. Horses struggled in the current and slipped on the muddy banks. Macedonian cavalrymen were struck down as they emerged from the water, unable to maneuver effectively on the treacherous slope. Alexander himself was in the thick of the fighting, his conspicuous armor making him a target for every Persian noble seeking glory. A Persian commander named Mithridates, son-in-law to Darius himself, rode directly at Alexander and hurled his javelin. Alexander dodged and struck Mithridates with his lance, driving him from his horse. Another Persian noble, Rosaces, swung his sword at Alexander's head with such force that it shattered the king's helmet and cut into his scalp. As Rosaces raised his sword for a killing blow, Cletus the Black, one of Alexander's officers, drove his spear through the Persian's body, saving the king's life. A third Persian, Spithridates, attempted to attack Alexander from behind, but again Cletus intervened, severing Spithridates' arm with his sword. Despite these desperate moments, the Macedonian cavalry gradually established a foothold on the eastern bank. More and more riders crossed the river, and the Persian cavalry line began to buckle under the pressure. Once the Macedonians had sufficient numbers on the Persian side, their superior discipline and tactics began to tell. The Persian cavalry, lacking the training and cohesion of the companions, started to break apart. Individual nobles fought bravely, but there was no coordination, no unified response to the Macedonian attack. When the Persian cavalry finally collapsed and fled, the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia found themselves exposed and abandoned. They attempted to surrender, but Alexander, furious that Greeks would fight against Greeks for foreign gold, ordered them cut down. Only 2,000 of the approximately 20,000 Greek mercenaries survived to be sent back to Macedonia in chains to work as slaves in the mines. It was a ruthless decision that reflected Alexander's sense of Greek unity and his rage against those who betrayed it. The victory at Granicus was complete and devastating for the Persian defense of Asia Minor. The satraps who had led the defense were dead or fleeing eastward. The Persian garrisons in the cities of Western Asia Minor found themselves isolated and unable to mount effective resistance. Most cities opened their gates to Alexander, welcoming him as a liberator from Persian rule. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a champion of Greek freedom, come to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor from Persian domination. He abolished the tribute they had paid to Persia and established democratic governments in place of Persian-backed oligarchies or tyrants. These were propaganda victories as well as military ones, demonstrating that Alexander fought not for personal gain, but for Greek freedom, not to replace one empire with another, but to spread Greek civilization and political liberty. Of course, the reality was more complex. The cities that welcomed Alexander soon discovered that they had simply exchanged one master for another. Alexander needed money to pay his army and to support his campaign, and the cities that had paid tribute to Persia would now pay contributions to Macedonia. The democratic governments he established were answerable to Macedonian oversight. Still, for the Greek cities of Asia Minor, Macedonian rule was generally lighter and more congenial than Persian rule had been, and there was genuine enthusiasm for Alexander's cause, at least initially. As Alexander moved south along the coast, liberating city after city, his reputation grew. He was no longer merely the son of Philip, the young king whose position had seemed so precarious only months before. He was Alexander the victor, the champion who had defeated the Persians in open battle, and who seemed destined for even greater triumphs. Not every city submitted peacefully. The great port city of Miletus, with strong walls and a Persian garrison, attempted to resist. Alexander besieged it, bringing up siege engines and coordinating naval and land forces to cut off all possibility of relief or escape. After hard fighting, Miletus fell, but Alexander's treatment of the city was far more lenient than his treatment of Thebes had been. The population was spared, and most of the defenders were allowed to leave. He was learning to balance terror with mercy, using the threat of destruction to encourage surrender while showing that submission would be rewarded with clemency. Further south, the city of Halicarnassus, where the Persian commander Memnon had established his headquarters, proved a tougher challenge. Halicarnassus had formidable fortifications and a determined garrison. The siege dragged on for months, with Alexander bringing his full arsenal of siegecraft to bear. Eventually, the defenders burned parts of the city and evacuated by sea, leaving Alexander in possession of ruins. He left a garrison and moved on, unwilling to waste more time on a single city when all of Asia awaited him. As winter approached in his first year in Asia, Alexander ventured inland from the coast, securing control of the Phrygian heartland of Asia Minor. At Gordium, the old Phrygian capital, he encountered one of the most famous puzzles of antiquity. In the Acropolis of Gordium stood an ancient wagon dedicated to Zeus by Midas, the legendary king of Phrygia. The wagon's yoke was tied to a pole with an intricate knot of cornel bark, and prophecy held that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would rule all of Asia. Many had tried and failed to unravel its complexities. When Alexander was shown the knot, he studied it briefly, then drew his sword and cut through it with a single stroke. Whether this story is historical or legendary, it captured something essential about Alexander's character and methods. He did not accept that problems were insoluble or that prophecies could not be fulfilled. If the traditional approach would not work, he would create a new approach. If the rules seemed to make victory impossible, he would change the rules. This quality, this refusal to accept limitations, would drive him throughout his conquests. In the spring of 333, Alexander moved south through the Cilician Gates, the narrow pass through the Taurus Mountains that connected central Anatolia with the Levantine coast. He was aiming to secure the entire eastern Mediterranean coast, to cut the Persian navy off from its ports and bases. Darius, meanwhile, had finally assembled a great army in Syria and Mesopotamia. The great king had initially not taken the Macedonian invasion seriously, trusting his satraps to deal with this impertinent Greek upstart. The disaster at Granicus had changed his assessment. He now understood that Alexander was a serious threat who required the full mobilization of imperial power to defeat. The army Darius assembled was vast, drawing on the military resources of the entire empire. It included the best of the Persian cavalry, the immortals who formed the core of the imperial guard, Greek mercenaries, and contingents from every satrap of the empire. The two armies met in November of 333 near the town of Issus, on a narrow coastal plain trapped between the mountains and the sea. The location favored Alexander. Darius's vast superiority in numbers was negated by the restricted space, which did not allow him to deploy his full strength or to outflank the Macedonian position. Modern historians estimate that Darius may have had perhaps 90,000 troops, though ancient sources claim impossibly large numbers. Alexander probably had around 40,000, having been reinforced since Granicus. The battle began with missile exchanges, Persian archers shooting volleys of arrows into the Macedonian lines while Macedonian light infantry. The charge was Alexander's standard tactic, but it required extraordinary courage to execute. He was leading his cavalry directly at the strongest point of the Persian line, trusting in speed, shock, and concentrated force to break through. The companions smashed into the Persian guards, lances splintering against shields and armor, horses screaming, and men dying in the brutal intimacy of hand-to-hand combat. Alexander himself was always at the front of these charges, his position marked by his distinctive armor and plumes, taking the same risks as his men, and often greater risks, deliberately seeking out the enemy commanders for personal combat. This leadership from the front was one of the secrets of his success. His men followed him into the most desperate situations because they knew he asked nothing of them that he would not do himself, that their king shared their dangers and would not abandon them in the crisis of battle. At Issus, the charge succeeded brilliantly. The Macedonian wedge drove toward Darius's position, cutting through the Persian guards with terrible efficiency. Darius, watching the Macedonian cavalry crash through his defenses, seeing Alexander himself apparently heading directly toward his chariot, lost his nerve. He turned his chariot and fled the battlefield, abandoning his army in its moment of greatest need. The effect on Persian morale was catastrophic. When the word spread that the great king had fled, Persian units began to break and run. What had been a hard-fought battle turned into a rout. The Macedonians pursued, killing thousands of Persian soldiers as they attempted to escape through the narrow mountain passes. The Persian camp fell into Alexander's hands, filled with treasure, baggage, and most dramatically, Darius's own family. The great king had brought his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, his 2 daughters, and his young son with him on campaign. This was normal for Persian kings, who travelled with their households and conducted court business even on military campaigns. But it meant that when Darius fled and his camp was overrun, his entire family fell into the hands of the enemy. Alexander's treatment of these royal captives was one of the most politically astute acts of his career. He visited the Persian royal women personally, reassuring them that they would not be harmed, that they would be treated with the honor due to their rank, that Darius himself was not dead, merely defeated. Sisygambis, the queen mother, apparently mistook Hephaestion for Alexander, since Hephaestion was taller and more conventionally imposing in appearance. When she realized her error and began to apologize, Alexander graciously told her she had made no mistake, for Hephaestion was also Alexander, a revealing comment on the closeness of their relationship. By treating Darius's family with respect, rather than enslaving or executing them, Alexander demonstrated that he was not a barbarian conqueror, but a civilized king who understood honor and mercy. He was also creating a powerful propaganda tool. Darius would now have to deal with the knowledge that his family was in enemy hands, that their safety depended on Alexander's continued goodwill, that he had failed in the most basic duty of a husband and father to protect his own family. The emotional and political impact of this situation would haunt Darius throughout the remainder of his life. Alexander also captured thousands of talents of gold and silver in the Persian camp, wealth that would allow him to pay his army and to continue his campaign without worrying about finances. The victory at Issus fundamentally changed the balance of power. Alexander was no longer a raider or rebel king. He had defeated the great king himself in open battle. The path to further conquest lay open before him. After Issus, Alexander faced a strategic choice. He could pursue Darius inland, attempting to finish the war with another decisive battle, or he could continue south along the Mediterranean coast, securing his control of the sea lanes and cutting Persia off from its western territories. He chose the latter course, despite the advice of some officers who urged immediate pursuit. Alexander understood that the Persian navy still controlled the sea, and as long as they did, his communications with Macedonia and Greece were vulnerable. The Persian fleet could strike at the Aegean Islands, perhaps even attempt a landing in Greece itself, encouraging rebellion and cutting Alexander off from reinforcements and supplies. By conquering the Phoenician coast with its great port cities, Alexander would deprive the Persian fleet of its bases and effectively end its naval superiority. The great Phoenician city of Tyre posed the most significant challenge. Tyre was built on an island half a mile offshore, surrounded by walls that rose directly from the sea. It had never been successfully besieged, and its inhabitants were confident in their impregnability. When Alexander demanded their submission, the Tyrians initially offered a compromise. They would honor Alexander as overlord, but would not admit his army into their city. Alexander found this unacceptable. He needed complete control of the coast, and he could not leave a hostile, fortified city in his rear. Moreover, his prestige and the siege of Tyre would last 7 months and would require Alexander to attempt what no previous besieger had managed. He ordered the construction of a causeway from the mainland to the island city, a mole of stone and timber that would allow his siege engines to reach Tyre's walls. It was an engineering project of staggering ambition. Thousands of workers labored to build the causeway, hauling rocks and timbers into the sea, while Tyrian ships harassed them and Tyrian defenders shot at them from the walls. The Tyrians launched fireships, vessels filled with flammable materials and sent against the causeway to burn the wooden siege towers Alexander had built. They sent divers to attack the foundations of the causeway underwater. But Alexander persisted, widening the causeway, building new towers, assembling a fleet of his own from conquered Phoenician cities that had submitted to him. The siege became a contest of engineering and determination. Alexander brought up every siege engine his engineers could devise, battering rams mounted on ships, siege towers built to the height of Tyre's walls, catapults hurling stones and fire. The Tyrians dropped massive boulders into the sea in front of their walls to prevent ships from approaching close enough to use rams. Alexander had divers cut the ropes holding the boulders and roll them away. The Tyrians heated sand and poured it on attackers. The sand would get inside armor and burn the skin more effectively than boiling oil. Alexander's troops attacked in shifts, giving them no respite. Gradually, relentlessly, the causeway reached the island, and the Macedonian siege engines began to make breaches in the walls. In July of 332, Macedonian forces broke into the city from multiple points simultaneously, ships forcing the harbors, while assault troops poured through breaches in the walls. The fall of Tyre was followed by massacre. The Tyrians had defied Alexander for 7 months, had killed thousands of his soldiers, had made him appear less than invincible. In his rage, Alexander allowed his troops to kill 8,000 Tyrian defenders and enslaved 30,000 of the city's inhabitants. 2,000 Tyrians were crucified on the beach, a brutal warning to any other city considering resistance. The siege of Tyre demonstrated both Alexander's capabilities and his ruthlessness. He would not accept defeat or even delay. He would pay any price, spend any amount of time, accept any number of casualties to achieve his objectives. And cities that resisted him would face terrible consequences. The message was received throughout the region. Most cities on Alexander's path submitted without resistance. From Phoenicia, Alexander turned south into Palestine and Egypt. Gaza, the last major fortress before Egypt, attempted to resist under its Persian commander, Battis. The siege lasted 2 months and featured some of the most vicious fighting of the campaign. Alexander was wounded twice, once by a catapult bolt that pierced his shoulder and shield, and once by a stone hurled from the walls. When the city finally fell, Alexander's fury at Battis was extreme. Ancient sources claim that Alexander had thongs pass through Battis's ankles and dragged him behind a chariot around the city until he died, a deliberate echo of Achilles' treatment of Hector in the Iliad. Whether this gruesome story is accurate or propaganda by Alexander's enemies, it reflects the darker aspects of Alexander's character, his terrible rage when opposed, and his identification with Homeric heroes to the point of replicating their most savage acts. Egypt, by contrast, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. The Egyptians had never reconciled themselves to Persian rule, which they saw as foreign domination by barbarians who did not respect Egyptian religion and traditions. The Persian satrap wisely chose not to resist, and Alexander entered Egypt unopposed in the winter of 332 to 331. He was crowned as pharaoh at Memphis, participating in Egyptian religious ceremonies, and presenting himself as the legitimate ruler of Egypt in the Egyptian tradition. This willingness to adapt to local customs and to present himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the rightful heir to native traditions would become characteristic of Alexander's rule. Unlike the Persians, who had often ruled their vast empire through force and had sometimes shown contempt for the religions and customs of subject peoples, Alexander generally showed respect for local traditions and sought to integrate conquered peoples into his empire through a fusion of Greek and native elements. While in Egypt, Alexander took a small expedition westward into the Libyan desert to visit the oracle of Amun at the Siwa oasis. The journey was dangerous, crossing waterless wastes where ancient writers claim Alexander and his companions were saved from dying of thirst only by miraculous rainstorms or by ravens guiding them to water. At Siwa, Alexander consulted the oracle, and what was said between him and the priests remained secret. But when Alexander emerged, he claimed that the oracle had confirmed he was the son of Zeus Amun, the Greek and Egyptian god, conflated into a single deity. Whether Alexander believed this or merely found it politically useful is debatable. In Greek and Macedonian culture, many heroes and even some historical figures claimed divine ancestry, and such claims were not necessarily taken literally. The most lasting consequence of Alexander's time in Egypt was the founding of Alexandria, the city that would become one of the great metropolises of the ancient world. Alexander chose the site personally, a strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean, with a natural harbour protected by the island of Pharos. He laid out the city's basic plan himself, marking the courses of the walls and the locations of temples and public buildings. The city was designed as a Greek polis, but one open to Egyptian and other non-Greek residents, a cosmopolitan centre of trade and culture. After Alexander's death, Alexandria would become the capital of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the intellectual centre of the Hellenistic world, home to the greatest library of antiquity and to scholars, scientists, and poets who would preserve and expand upon Greek learning. Of all the many cities Alexander would found, Alexandria in Egypt would be the most successful and enduring. In the spring of 331, Alexander left Egypt and marched north and east toward Mesopotamia. Darius had spent the 18 months since his defeat at Issus assembling another army, even larger than the first. He had stripped every province of troops, called in contingents from the eastern satrapies, hired every Greek mercenary he could find. He had assembled a force so vast that ancient historians could not accurately count it. They spoke of hundreds of thousands of infantry and tens of thousands of cavalry. Modern estimates suggest perhaps 250,000 men, still a staggering number. Darius had also prepared the battlefield, choosing a broad plain near Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia and having it levelled and cleared to favour his cavalry and chariots. He had even prepared special weapons, scythed chariots with blades extending from their wheels and axles, designed to cut through infantry formations and create gaps that cavalry could exploit. The two armies met on October 1st, 331. Alexander had perhaps 50,000 troops, outnumbered perhaps 5-1 by the Persian host. The night before the battle, Alexander's generals urged him to attack in darkness, using surprise to offset the Persian numerical advantage. Alexander refused, saying he would not steal a victory like a thief in the night. Whether this was confidence, bravado, or calculation is unclear. A night attack would have been risky, likely to result in confusion and chaos that might favour neither side. A daylight battle would allow Alexander to fully employ his superior tactics and the discipline of his troops. It would also make his victory, when it came, unquestionable, a clear triumph of skill over mere numbers. As the armies deployed in the dawn light, the disparity in size must have been sobering for the Macedonians. The Persian line extended far beyond both flanks of the Macedonian position. Darius had positioned himself in the centre, in a chariot decorated with the symbols of his office, surrounded by his best troops. His cavalry wings overlapped the Macedonian army, threatening to envelop it from both sides. His scythed chariots were positioned to charge into the Macedonian phalanx, followed by infantry assault through the gaps they would create. It looked like an overwhelming force, carefully positioned and prepared. Yet Darius had made crucial mistakes. His army, for all its size, lacked the cohesion and training of the Macedonian force. Many of his troops were levies from distant provinces who had never fought together, who spoke different languages, who had little loyalty to the Persian throne. His commanders were satraps and nobles, who were accustomed to independent authority and who might not coordinate effectively in the chaos of battle. Alexander's battle plan was characteristically bold. He would refuse his left flank, holding defensively with his Greek allied troops and some of his phalanx, while his right wing, led by himself and the companion cavalry, would angle toward the Persian left. This oblique approach would draw Darius's cavalry out of position, creating gaps in the Persian line. When the gap appeared, Alexander would lead a decisive charge directly at Darius's position. It was a plan that required perfect timing, iron discipline, and extraordinary courage. If the left flank broke before Alexander could strike his blow, the Macedonian army would be surrounded and destroyed. If the phalanx did not hold when the chariot struck it, the formation would dissolve. If Alexander's charge failed to reach Darius or failed to panic the great king into flight, the companion cavalry would be isolated deep in the Persian army and would be annihilated. The battle began with the Persian chariots thundering toward the Macedonian lines, blades flashing in the morning sun. But the Macedonians had prepared for this. As the chariots approached, the phalanx opened lanes, allowing them to pass through harmlessly, while light infantry struck at the horses and drivers with javelins. Those chariots that did strike the phalanx found the sarissa hedge impenetrable. Horses would not charge into the wall of spear points, and the chariots veered off or stopped, their crews cut down. The feared scythe chariots proved almost useless, a weapon more terrifying in imagination than in reality. Meanwhile, Alexander was leading his cavalry right toward the edge of the Persian line, forcing Darius to shift. Alexander saw the opening and immediately ordered the charge. The companion cavalry, formed in their wedge formation with Alexander at the apex, thundered across the plain directly at Darius's position. Behind them came units of the phalanx exploiting the gap. The charge was devastating in its focus and violence. Everything depended on speed and shock, on reaching Darius before the Persian guards could fully react, on spreading panic rather than fighting a grinding battle of attrition. As the companions smashed into the Persian guards around Darius, Alexander was again in the thick of the fighting, his armor streaked with blood, his face grim with concentration and battle fury. The Persians fought desperately to protect their king, but the momentum was irresistible. More and more Macedonians poured through the gap, widening it, turning it into a breach that threatened to split the Persian army in two. And then, for the second time, Darius's nerve broke. As Macedonian cavalry closed on his chariot, as his guards fell around him, as the situation deteriorated from controlled battle to desperate melee, the great king ordered his chariot to turn and flee. Once again, his departure triggered a collapse of Persian morale. The troops around the king's position, seeing him abandon the field, began to fall back. The retreat turned into a rout as more units joined the flight. The Persian right wing, which had actually broken through the Macedonian left and was plundering the baggage camp, suddenly found itself isolated as the center collapsed. Some Persian cavalry attempted to rescue Darius's family from the baggage camp, but found they were too well guarded. The entire Persian army began to disintegrate, units breaking apart and fleeing in all directions. The pursuit was relentless. Alexander chased Darius personally for 75 miles before losing his trail in the darkness. The Macedonian cavalry killed tens of thousands of fleeing Persian soldiers, and the roads were littered with abandoned equipment, wounded men, and exhausted horses. Darius escaped to the eastern satrapies, but his authority was shattered. He had now fled from 2 battles, had left his armies to die while he saved himself, had demonstrated that for all the pomp and ceremony of Persian kingship, he lacked the courage to stand and fight. The satraps of the eastern provinces would soon lose what little loyalty they had felt to this failed king. The Persian Empire, which had seemed invincible, which had dominated the Near East for 2 centuries, had effectively ended on the field at Gaugamela. Alexander was now, in fact, if not yet in title, the King of Kings, the ruler of the greatest empire the world had yet seen. After Gaugamela, the great cities of Mesopotamia opened their gates to Alexander. Babylon, the ancient city where Hammurabi had issued his law code and where Nebuchadnezzar had built the Hanging Gardens, welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. The Babylonian priests, who had never reconciled themselves to Persian religious policies, acclaimed Alexander as the legitimate ruler chosen by the god Marduk. Alexander made sacrifices to Babylonian gods, participated in local ceremonies, and ordered the restoration of temples that the Persians had supposedly damaged. It was a pattern he would repeat, respecting local religions, presenting himself as the legitimate heir to local traditions, gaining the support of priests and local elites by treating them with honor rather than as conquered peoples. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Susa, another of the Persian royal capitals, where he found enormous treasures accumulated over centuries of Persian rule. The wealth he captured at Susa and subsequently at Persepolis would finance his operations for years and would fundamentally alter the economy of the Mediterranean world as Persian gold began to flow westward. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital built by Darius I and Xerxes, was the ultimate symbol of Persian imperial power. It was to Persepolis that the Persian kings came for their coronations, and it was to Persepolis that the annual tribute from all the satrapies of the empire was brought. The city was famous for its magnificent palaces and its sculptures showing the peoples of the empire bringing gifts to the great king. Alexander reached Persepolis in January of 330. After a difficult winter march through the mountains, the city surrendered, and Alexander took possession of treasures that ancient sources estimated at 120,000 talents of gold and silver, an almost incomprehensible sum that required thousands of mules and camels to transport. The wealth of Persepolis represented centuries of imperial exploitation, tribute extracted from conquered peoples and accumulated in the Persian treasury. What happened next remains one of the most controversial episodes of Alexander's career. After several months in Persepolis, during a banquet, fire broke out in the palaces. Ancient sources offer different versions of what happened. Some claim it was deliberate revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier, a symbolic act of Greek vengeance. Plutarch tells a story that a courtesan named Thais urged Alexander to burn the palace during a drunken revel, and that Alexander, drunk and caught up in the moment, led the torch-bearing procession himself. Other sources suggest it was accidental, or that Alexander later regretted the destruction. What is certain is that the great palace of Xerxes, the burning of Persepolis, had deep symbolic meaning. If it was indeed deliberate, it marked the end of Persian power and the completion of Greek revenge for the Persian invasions. It was a statement that Alexander was not simply replacing Darius as great king, but was establishing a new order, one based on Macedonian and Greek power rather than on Persian traditions. Yet there was also a contradiction here, because in other ways, Alexander was increasingly adopting Persian customs and Persian court ceremonial. He began to wear elements of Persian royal dress, mixing Macedonian and Persian styles. He employed Persian administrators in his government. He honored Persian nobles and gradually integrated them into his court and army. This blending of cultures would become more pronounced as Alexander moved eastward and would eventually cause serious tensions with his Macedonian companions, who saw themselves as conquerors, not as partners in a multicultural empire. From Persepolis, Alexander set out in pursuit of Darius, who had fled to the eastern provinces and was attempting to raise a new army. The chase led through Media and into Parthia, across increasingly difficult terrain. Darius's remaining supporters were falling away, and his own satraps were beginning to question his leadership. In the summer of 330, Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, and other eastern satraps decided that Darius was a liability. They arrested the great king, bound him in golden chains, and continued fleeing eastward. When it became clear that Alexander's cavalry was catching up, Bessus and his co-conspirators stabbed Darius and left him dying by the roadside. When Alexander's scouts found Darius, he was already dead or dying, depending on which account one believes. Alexander reportedly covered Darius's body with his own cloak and later sent it back to Persepolis for burial with royal honors. Whether this gesture was genuine respect for a fallen opponent or political theater designed to show that Alexander was the legitimate avenger of the murdered king, it was effective. Alexander now styled himself as the rightful heir to the Persian throne, the avenger of Darius, and the pursuer of the traitors who had murdered their legitimate king. Bessus fled to Bactria and Sogdiana, the northeastern satrapies in what is now Afghanistan and Central Asia, and proclaimed himself Great King, taking the name Artaxerxes. Alexander spent the next 3 years in brutal campaigning in these mountainous regions, fighting not set-piece battles against organized armies, but guerrilla warfare against tribesmen who knew the terrain intimately and who used hit-and-run tactics to frustrate the Macedonians. This was a different kind of war from the great battles against Darius, harder and more frustrating, with no decisive victories that could end the campaign. The Macedonians had to fight their way through mountain passes where small forces could hold up entire armies, had to storm fortresses built on seemingly inaccessible crags, had to endure extreme climates from burning deserts to freezing mountain winters. Many Macedonian soldiers died not in battle, but from exposure, disease, and exhaustion. It was during this Central Asian campaign that the darkest incidents of Alexander's reign occurred. The tensions between Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs and his Macedonian companions' resistance to these changes came to a violent head. Alexander attempted to introduce the Persian practice of proskinesis, ritual prostration before the king, into his court. To Persians, this was normal court etiquette, a sign of respect for the king's office. To Greeks and Macedonians, who prostrated themselves only before gods, it seemed like Alexander was demanding to be worshipped as a deity. Many of Alexander's companions found this deeply offensive, a betrayal of Macedonian traditions of relative equality between king and nobles. The resistance was led by Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who had joined the expedition as the official historian. Callisthenes openly criticized Alexander's pretensions to divinity and his adoption of Persian customs. The conflict came to a crisis when a conspiracy to assassinate Alexander was discovered among the royal pages, young nobles who served in the king's household. Under torture, one of the conspirators apparently implicated Callisthenes, claiming he had encouraged their plot. Whether Callisthenes was actually involved, or whether this was a false accusation made under duress, is unknown. Alexander had Callisthenes arrested and, according to some sources, executed or allowed to die in prison. The death of Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, allegedly on the flimsiest of evidence, marked a breaking point in Alexander's relationship with the Greek intellectual world that had shaped his early education. It suggested that the young king who had once studied philosophy with Aristotle had been transformed by power and success into someone capable of tyrannical cruelty against those who questioned his will. Escalated, with Cletus becoming more insulting and Alexander growing angrier. Friends tried to separate them, but Cletus continued to shout criticisms of Alexander, accusing him of forgetting his Macedonian heritage and becoming an Oriental despot. In a rage, Alexander seized a spear from one of his guards and drove it through Cletus, killing him instantly. When he realized what he had done, Alexander was overcome with grief and remorse. He locked himself in his room for 3 days, refusing food, calling himself a murderer, threatening to kill himself. His friends eventually convinced him to emerge and to continue the campaign, but the incident revealed how the years of constant warfare, the adulation of his troops, and the assumption of absolute power had affected Alexander's character. The young man who had been educated by Aristotle to value reason and self-control had become someone capable of killing a friend in a drunken rage over an insult. The campaign in Central Asia finally ended when Bessus was betrayed by his own followers and turned over to Alexander. Alexander had Bessus tried for the murder of Darius and executed in a particularly brutal Persian fashion, having his nose and ears cut off before he was crucified or torn apart by horses, depending on the source. The execution was meant to demonstrate that Alexander was the legitimate avenger of Darius, and that those who committed regicide would face terrible punishment. With Bessus dead and organized resistance in Bactria and Sogdiana crushed, Alexander was able to consolidate his control over these regions. He founded cities, usually called Alexandria, garrisoned with Greek and Macedonian settlers who were often veterans too old or too injured to continue campaigning. These cities would serve as centers of Greek culture and military power, holding down the region and facilitating trade between East and West. It was in Sogdiana that Alexander married Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian nobleman named Oxyates. The circumstances of their meeting were romantic by ancient standards. Oxyates had taken refuge with his family on the supposedly impregnable Sogdian rock, a fortress on a mountain peak that seemed unreachable. Alexander offered terms of surrender, but Oxyates' garrison mocked the offer, asking if Alexander's soldiers had wings to fly up the cliff. Alexander selected 300 of his best climbers, offered them huge rewards, and had them scale the cliff face in darkness using iron pegs and rope. Several fell to their deaths during the ascent, but the survivors reached the summit and displayed themselves to the amazed defenders at dawn. The garrison, thinking they were surrounded, surrendered. Among the captives was Roxana, who ancient writers describe as the most beautiful woman in Asia after Darius's wife. Alexander fell in love with her, or at least was attracted enough to marry her despite his commander's concerns that marrying a barbarian princess would alienate his Macedonian supporters. The marriage to Roxana was both a personal choice and a political decision. By marrying into the Bactrian nobility, Alexander created a bond with the local aristocracy and demonstrated his willingness to see Persians and other Asian peoples as partners rather than merely conquered subjects. This policy of fusion between Greeks and Persians would become more pronounced as time went on. Alexander increasingly relied on Persian administrators, incorporated Persian cavalry units into his army, and adopted elements of Persian court ceremonial. To many of his Macedonian companions, this seemed like betrayal. They had followed Alexander to conquer Persia, not to become Persians themselves. They saw themselves as superior to the peoples they had defeated and resented Alexander's apparent belief that Greeks and Persians could be equal partners in his empire. These tensions would persist and intensify, but for now, Alexander's attention turned toward an even more ambitious goal. The eastern edge of the Persian Empire had been India, the rich lands beyond the Hindu Kush mountains and the Indus River. In the spring of 327, Alexander led his army across the Hindu Kush, following in the footsteps of the Persian kings who had once claimed these territories as tributaries. The mountain crossing was brutal, with many men and horses dying from cold and lack of supplies. The army descended into the Kabul Valley and then to the Indus, where Alexander had had a bridge built in preparation for the invasion. Local rulers, aware of Alexander's military power and perhaps hoping to use Macedonian support in their own regional conflicts, generally submitted without resistance. But not all Indian kingdoms were willing to accept Macedonian overlordship without a fight. Alexander's most formidable opponent in India was King Porus, who ruled a kingdom between the Hydaspes and Acacynes rivers in what is now Punjab. Porus was a giant of a man by ancient accounts, standing over 6 feet tall at a time when most men were considerably shorter. He commanded a powerful army that included not only cavalry and infantry, but also war elephants, creatures that the Macedonians had encountered before, but never in such numbers or used so effectively. When Alexander reached the Hydaspes River in May of 326, he found Porus's army waiting on the opposite bank. The river was in flood from spring snowmelt, wide and fast-flowing, and Porus's elephants were positioned to attack any force attempting to cross. The situation seemed similar to Granicus, but the presence of the elephants made it far more dangerous. Horses were terrified of elephants, and a crossing under these conditions could easily turn into a disaster. Alexander spent weeks conducting feints and maneuvers, moving his forces up and down the riverbank, keeping Porus's army in constant motion and uncertainty about where the real crossing would come. Finally, on a dark, stormy night, Alexander took a substantial force 20 miles upstream, crossed at a fordable point, and began marching back downstream toward Porus's main position. When Porus learned of the crossing, he was forced to divide his army. He sent a force under his son to stop Alexander's advance, while keeping the bulk of his army in position to prevent the rest of the Macedonian army from crossing. Alexander's forces defeated and killed Porus's son, then continued their advance. Porus now had to choose between facing Alexander's force or staying in position, and he chose to march out and give battle, taking his elephants with him and leaving only a small force to watch the main Macedonian army. The Battle of the Hydaspes was one of Alexander's most tactically brilliant victories. He faced not only a capable enemy commander, but also a type of military unit, the war elephants, that posed unique challenges. The elephants were massive, terrifying beasts that could trample infantry, scatter cavalry, and serve as platforms for archers. Porus positioned them in his front line, with infantry between them and cavalry on the wings. Alexander adapted his tactics brilliantly. He refused to commit his cavalry to a direct assault on the elephants, knowing it would fail. Instead, he used his cavalry to attack Porus's cavalry wings, driving them back against their own infantry and elephants. Meanwhile, his light infantry used javelins and arrows to attack the elephants from a distance, targeting the drivers and the elephants themselves. The wounded elephants began to panic, turning and trampling their own troops. The Macedonian phalanx then advanced, their sarissas keeping the elephants at bay while they engaged the Indian infantry. The battle was long and hard fought, lasting perhaps 8 hours. Porus himself fought with extraordinary courage, continuing to direct his forces, even after being wounded multiple times. He refused to flee or surrender, fighting from the back of his elephant until it became clear the battle was lost and most of his army was dead or routed. Finally, too weak from loss of blood to continue, he had his elephant kneel so he could dismount. When brought before Alexander, the Indian king was asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied simply, "Like a king." Alexander, impressed by his courage and dignity in defeat, not only restored Porus to his kingdom, but added territory to it, making him an ally and subordinate rather than a conquered enemy. This magnanimity toward a brave opponent was one of Alexander's most attractive qualities, a genuine respect for martial courage that transcended cultural differences. The victory at the Hydaspes was Alexander's last great set-piece battle, and in many ways his most impressive. He had adapted his tactics to an unfamiliar enemy and unfamiliar conditions, had maneuvered brilliantly to force battle under favorable circumstances, and had won decisively against a brave and skillful opponent. But the campaign in India had taken a toll on his army. The men had been fighting continuously for 8 years, had marched thousands of miles through deserts and over mountains, had endured extremes of climate from the cold of the Hindu Kush to the heat and monsoon rains of India. They had acquired enormous wealth from their conquests, and many wanted to go home to enjoy their plunder, to see their families, to rest. Alexander, by contrast, wanted to continue eastward. He had heard of the rich kingdoms of the Ganges Valley and believed that the edge of the world lay not far beyond. His ambition was limitless. He wanted to reach the ends of the earth, to see the great ocean that Greek geographers believed encircled all lands. Alexander led his army eastward from the Hydaspes, fighting through difficult terrain and monsoon rains, subduing the Indian tribes and kingdoms in his path. But the fighting was hard, the conditions miserable, and the army's morale was deteriorating. At the Hyphasis River, now called the Bees, the army finally refused to go further. Alexander's officers, led by Coenus, one of his most trusted commanders, came to him and explained that the men would not continue. They had followed him loyally for years, had fought in every battle, had conquered the known world, but they were exhausted. Their equipment was worn out, their horses were dying, and their spirits were broken by the endless rain and the prospect of fighting yet more unknown enemies in unknown lands. They wanted to go home. Alexander was furious. He sulked in his tent for 3 days, hoping the army would change its mind, but the men would not be moved. Finally, he emerged and announced that they would turn back, but he made it clear that he was yielding to their weakness rather than agreeing with their decision. The mutiny at the Hyphasis marked a turning point. Alexander had always pushed his men hard, but he had always carried them with him through the force of his personality and his shared hardships. Now, for the first time, his will had met an obstacle it could not overcome. His army would go no further, and without his army, Alexander the Conqueror could do nothing. The return journey from India was nightmarish, perhaps worse than any of the fighting. Alexander refused to take the direct route back. Instead, he decided to explore and conquer the southern Indus Valley and then return to Mesopotamia, partly by sea and partly by marching through Gadrosia, the coastal desert region of what is now southern Pakistan and Iran. During the assault on the city of the Mali, Alexander committed one of his most recklessly brave acts. The siege was proceeding slowly, and Alexander, impatient, scaled the city walls with only a few companions. Finding himself on the wall ahead of his troops, he jumped down into the city, accompanied only by 3 officers. The 4 Macedonians found themselves surrounded by enemies and fought desperately with their backs against the wall. An arrow struck Alexander in the chest, penetrating his lung. He collapsed, and his companions stood over him, fighting off the Mali warriors, until Macedonian troops smashed through the gate and rescued them. Alexander nearly died from this wound. He lost so much blood that he fell into a coma, and rumors spread through the army that he was dead. When he finally recovered enough to be seen, he insisted on displaying himself to the troops to prove he was alive, though he could barely stand and the effort nearly killed him. The wound at the Mali city demonstrated both Alexander's extraordinary courage and his recklessness. At 31 years old, he still fought like a young warrior seeking glory, still took the same risks as his common soldiers, still seemed driven by the Homeric ideal of achieving eternal fame through martial deeds. But he was no longer a young prince trying to prove himself. He was the ruler of an empire stretching from Greece to India, and his death in an obscure Indian city during a minor siege would have thrown his entire empire into chaos. His commanders must have been horrified by his behavior, but they could not control him. Alexander's need for action, for testing himself in battle, for pushing beyond all limits, remained undiminished by age or experience. After subduing the lower Indus Valley, Alexander divided his forces for the return journey. The fleet, under the command of Nearchus, would sail along the coast from the Indus Delta to the Persian Gulf, exploring and mapping the coastline. Part of the army would march through the more hospitable inland route through Arachosia. Alexander himself would take a force through Gedrosia, the coastal desert, partly to explore unknown territory and partly to establish supply depots for the fleet. The march through the Gedrosian desert became one of the worst disasters of Alexander's career. Ancient sources describe it as worse than all the battles the army had fought, a nightmare of heat, thirst, and sand. The desert was trackless and waterless. The local guides became lost, and the army began to disintegrate. Men died of thirst and heat exhaustion. Horses and pack animals collapsed and were left to die. Equipment was abandoned to lighten loads. The army marched at night to avoid the worst heat, but this made navigation even more difficult. Sandstorms buried men alive or separated units from each other. When water was found, soldiers rushed to it so desperately that they trampled each other, and discipline broke down. Wives and children who had followed the army died in the sand, too weak to continue, and their families had to leave them behind or die themselves. Alexander shared the hardships of his men, refusing water when there was not enough for everyone, marching on foot when the horses died. But his leadership could not overcome the desert. By the time the army reached Carmania and safety, perhaps 3/4 of those who had entered Gedrosia were dead. It was a catastrophic loss of life that served no military purpose, the result of Alexander's insistence on taking the most difficult route, and his refusal to admit that some challenges were not worth attempting. The reunited army, battered and diminished, made its way back to Persia. In Susa, in early 324, Alexander staged a massive wedding ceremony in which he married Stateira, the eldest daughter of Darius, and Parysatis, the daughter of the previous Persian king Artaxerxes. At the same ceremony, he had 90 of his senior officers marry Persian noblewomen, and he gave dowries and gifts to thousands of his soldiers who had married Asian women. The mass wedding was intended as a symbolic fusion of Greek and Persian elites, creating a new ruling class that would be both European and Asian. Alexander was trying to create an empire that was not merely Greek rule over conquered Persians, but a genuine partnership between the two peoples. He ordered 30,000 Persian boys to be trained in Macedonian military techniques and Greek language and culture, intending to integrate them into his army as a new force loyal to him personally rather than to any particular ethnic group. These policies provoked intense resentment among many of Alexander's Macedonian veterans. They had fought for years to conquer the Persian Empire, and now Alexander seemed to be giving away their hard-won dominance to the very people they had defeated. When Alexander announced at Opis that he was discharging his older veterans and sending them home with generous bonuses, the army mutinied, not because they did not want to go home, but because they interpreted the discharge as Alexander replacing them with Persian troops. The veterans felt betrayed, cast aside after years of service, replaced by Persians who had never fought for Alexander. Alexander responded with characteristic fury. He leapt from the platform where he had been speaking, personally pointed out the ringleaders of the mutiny, and had them arrested and, after 3 days of this standoff, with the army shocked and confused, Alexander emerged and began appointing Persians to key commands. The Macedonian veterans, realizing that Alexander was serious and that they were about to lose their privileged position entirely, broke down and begged for forgiveness. Ancient sources describe grown men weeping and pleading to be taken back into Alexander's favor. Alexander finally relented and arranged a great reconciliation banquet where 9,000 people, Macedonians and Persians seated together, drank from the same cups, and prayed to the same gods for harmony between the peoples. It was a masterful display of psychological manipulation and political theatre, demonstrating that Alexander still controlled his army absolutely, that his will remained indomitable even when challenged by the very veterans who had won his empire for him. But beneath the public reconciliation, tensions remained. The Macedonians accepted their king's decisions because they had no alternative, but many of them never reconciled themselves to Alexander's vision of a multicultural empire. They saw themselves as conquerors, not as partners with the conquered, and they resented the honors and positions Alexander gave to Persians. These resentments would explode after Alexander's death, when his successors would largely abandon his vision of fusion and instead establish kingdoms where Greeks and Macedonians ruled as a foreign elite over native populations. Alexander's dream of uniting East and West, of creating a new civilization that drew on the best of both Greek and Persian cultures, would die with him. In 324, while the army was encamped at Ecbatana, disaster struck. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and second in command, fell ill with a fever. For several days he seemed to be recovering under the care of Philip, Alexander's personal physician. But then Hephaestion defied his doctor's orders, ate a large meal, and drank heavily at a breakfast banquet. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and he died within hours. Alexander's grief was extreme, beyond anything he had shown for any other loss. He threw himself on Hephaestion's body and refused to be separated from it for a day. He cut his hair short in mourning, as Achilles had done for Patroclus. He ordered the tails and manes of all horses cut. He crucified the physician who had been treating Hephaestion, though the doctor's care had been competent, and the death was Hephaestion's own fault for ignoring medical advice. He ordered that sacred fires throughout the empire be extinguished, an honor reserved for the death of the great king himself. Alexander sent messengers to the oracle of Ammon in Egypt, asking whether Hephaestion should be honored as a hero or as a god. And when the oracle recommended hero cult, Alexander began planning elaborate monuments and ceremonies. He designed a funeral pyre at Babylon that would be over 200 feet high, decorated with golden eagles, sirens, centaurs, and other mythological figures, and costing many thousands of talents to construct. He announced funeral games and planned military campaigns as offerings to Hephaestion's memory. Ancient sources describe Alexander as almost insane with grief, unable to eat or sleep, making irrational decisions, and lashing out at anyone who failed to show sufficient mourning. Modern historians debate the nature of Alexander and Hephaestion's relationship, whether it was romantic, sexual, or simply the intense friendship that Greek culture celebrated. What is beyond debate is that Hephaestion's death devastated Alexander more than any military defeat or personal injury ever had. After weeks of mourning, Alexander attempted to distract himself with military activity. He conducted a savage campaign against a tribe called the Cossaians, massacring them as a kind of human sacrifice to Hephaestion's memory. But the grief remained, and colleagues noticed that Alexander seemed changed, more withdrawn, more prone to anger and suspicion, less resilient than he had been. He was 32 years old, had been fighting continuously for 12 years, had survived countless wounds and illnesses, and had driven himself harder than he drove any of his soldiers. The physical and emotional toll was beginning to show. In the spring of 323, Alexander led his army to Babylon, which he had chosen as his primary capital. He planned to launch new expeditions to explore and conquer Arabia, to campaign in the west against Carthage and the Italian tribes, perhaps to return to India and complete what he had started there. His ambitions remained unlimited, his energy apparently inexhaustible. But as Alexander approached Babylon, Chaldean priests, the traditional astrologers and soothsayers of Mesopotamia, came to him with dire warnings. They had observed the heavens and seen portents indicating that if the king entered Babylon, disaster would follow. They urged him to avoid the city, or at least to approach from a different direction. Alexander was initially inclined to heed these warnings, but his court philosopher, a Greek named Anaxarchus, scoffed at Chaldean superstition and encouraged Alexander to ignore it. How could a rational man, educated by Aristotle, take seriously the star? The exact sequence of events leading to Alexander's death remains murky, confused by contradictory ancient sources and by later propaganda. What seems certain is that on the evening of May 29th or May 30th, Alexander attended a prolonged drinking party at the house of his friend Medius of Larissa. Macedonian drinking parties could be extreme affairs, with wine consumed in large quantities and men expected to drink themselves into oblivion unconsciousness as a mark of manliness. Alexander drank heavily that night, then continued drinking through the following day. Sometime during or after this extended bacchanal, he developed a fever. At first, it seemed like a minor illness, perhaps nothing more than a hangover. But the fever persisted and grew worse. Over the next 11 or 12 days, Alexander's condition deteriorated steadily. Ancient accounts describe the progression of his illness day by day. He continued to make sacrifices and conduct business for the first few days, but his strength was failing. He developed a terrible thirst that could not be quenched. His speech became slurred and difficult to understand. He lost the ability to move, lying paralyzed while his mind remained apparently clear. As news spread that the king was dying, his soldiers demanded to see him, fearing that he was already dead, and that his generals were concealing the fact to buy time for political maneuvering. Alexander insisted that his bed be carried to where the troops could file past. He could no longer speak, but he acknowledged each soldier with his eyes or a gesture of his hand. It must have been an extraordinary scene, the greatest conqueror of the age reduced to helpless immobility, able only to offer silent farewells to the soldiers who had followed him to the ends of the earth. On the evening of June 10th or the early morning of June 11th, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old and had reigned for 12 years and 8 months. According to the royal diaries, a court record of Alexander's last days, when his companions asked to whom he left his kingdom, Alexander replied to the strongest, or possibly to Krateros, as the Greek words are similar and his speech was slurred. Whether he actually said either of these things, or whether the royal diaries themselves were later fabrications, remains disputed. What is certain is that Alexander left no clear succession plan, no grown heir, no arrangements for the governance of his vast empire after his death. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child was not yet born, and even if it was a boy, he would be an infant unable to rule for years. Alexander's half-brother Arrhidaeus was still alive, but was considered unfit to rule due to his mental incapacity. The empire Alexander had built through 12 years of warfare would have no legitimate ruler, and his generals would have no guidance about what to do next. The cause of Alexander's death has been debated for more than 2 millennia. The drinking party at Medius's house immediately suggested poison to many ancient writers, and elaborate conspiracy theories developed. Some blamed Antipater, Alexander's regent in Macedonia, who had conflicts with Olympias and who might have feared being replaced. Antipater's son, Cassander, was at Babylon and could theoretically have administered poison. Others blamed the sons of Parmenion, seeking revenge for their father's execution. Still others suspected jealous Macedonian nobles who resented Alexander's Persian policies or Persian nobles who wanted to end Greek rule. The problem with all poison theories is that ancient poisons, based on plant toxins like hemlock or aconite, acted quickly, within hours, not over 11 days. The slow progression of Alexander's illness is inconsistent with known ancient poisons. Modern medical experts examining the ancient descriptions of Alexander's symptoms have proposed various diseases. Some suggest typhoid fever, which was endemic in Mesopotamia, and which matches many of Alexander's symptoms, including the prolonged fever, dehydration, and progressive weakness. Others propose malaria, which Alexander would have contracted in India or during the fleet's voyage. West Nile virus has been suggested, as has acute pancreatitis triggered by alcoholism. A particularly intriguing recent theory suggests Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare autoimmune disorder that causes ascending paralysis while leaving the mind clear. This would explain why Alexander remained conscious and aware, even as his body shut down, and it would explain a detail mentioned in ancient sources that Alexander's body did not decompose for days after his death. As Guillain-Barré syndrome can cause such profound paralysis that the body appears dead before it actually is. The truth is that we will never know with certainty what killed Alexander. The ancient sources are contradictory, the medical evidence ambiguous, and the political motives for various accusations unclear. What we can say is that Alexander's death was tragically premature. He had conquered more territory than any previous military leader in history, had spread Greek civilization from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, had demonstrated tactical genius in dozens of battles, and had shown flashes of visionary statesmanship in his attempts to fuse different cultures into a unified empire. But he died without. When news of Alexander's death spread beyond Babylon, the reaction was mixed. In Greece, some cities celebrated, hoping to regain their independence. In Asia, some regions rebelled, thinking Macedonian rule would collapse without Alexander to enforce it. But in Babylon, Alexander's generals and companions faced an immediate crisis. What was to be done with the empire? Tradition suggested that the heir should be Alexander's unborn child, if it proved to be a boy, or perhaps his half-brother Aristeus, despite his incapacity. But none of the generals wanted to wait years for a child to grow up, and none wanted to serve a mentally disabled figurehead. After heated debates, they reached a compromise. Aristeus, renamed Philip III, would be king, and if Roxana's child was a boy, he would be co-king. Perdiccas, the senior cavalry commander, would serve as regent. Other generals received satrapies and military commands, carving up the empire among themselves. This compromise lasted mere months before it dissolved in violence. What followed was a series of wars called the Wars of the Diadochi, the successors, that would last for more than 40 years. Alexander's generals fought each other for control of pieces of the empire, forming and breaking alliances, assassinating rivals, and pursuing their own ambitions. Roxana's son, born after Alexander's death and named Alexander IV, was recognized as king, but he was a pawn in the struggles between the generals. Olympias, Alexander's mother, tried to secure power for her grandson and was eventually captured and killed by Cassander, who also murdered both Roxana and the young Alexander when the boy was about 13, ending Alexander's bloodline. Philip III Aristeus was also murdered in the civil wars. None of Alexander's family survived more than a few years past his death. From the chaos of the successor wars, several stable kingdoms eventually emerged. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's boyhood friends, secured Egypt and established a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries until the death of Cleopatra. Seleucus took control of most of Alexander's Asian conquests, establishing the Seleucid Empire that would stretch from Syria to Persia. Antigonus and his descendants eventually controlled Macedonia and parts of Greece. Smaller kingdoms emerged in Pergamum, Bactria, and elsewhere. None of these successors managed to reunite Alexander's empire. The unity he had imposed through his personality and military genius shattered immediately after his death. Yet, despite this political fragmentation, Alexander's conquests had permanent cultural effects that would shape the ancient world for centuries. The most important legacy was the spread of Greek culture, language, and cities throughout the Near East and as far as India. The period following Alexander's death is called the Hellenistic Age, from the Greek word meaning to speak Greek or identify with Greek culture. Alexander had founded dozens of cities, many named Alexandria, and his successors founded dozens more. These cities became centers of Greek culture, with Greek-style theaters, gymnasiums, and temples. But they were also multicultural centers, where Greeks lived alongside Egyptians, Persians, Indians, and other peoples. Greek became the common language of trade, diplomacy, and educated discourse throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. A Greek-speaking merchant from Egypt could travel to Bactria on the borders of India and find people who spoke his language and understood his culture. This cultural fusion, which Alexander had encouraged and which continued under his successors, produced remarkable achievements. In Alexandria, Egypt, the Ptolemies established the museum and library, which became the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. Scholars came from throughout the Hellenistic world to study there. The Alexandrian library attempted to collect copies of every book in existence, eventually holding hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Scholars at Alexandria made fundamental advances in mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, and philosophy. Euclid wrote his Elements there, systematizing geometry. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy. Archimedes studied there before returning to Syracuse. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, was produced in Alexandria. The city became a true world capital, not in political terms but in cultural and intellectual terms, exactly what Alexander had envisioned when he founded it. The Hellenistic kingdoms preserved and transmitted Greek culture to Rome, and through Rome to the medieval world, and eventually to us. When Rome conquered the Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, Romans encountered Greek culture in its Hellenistic form and were deeply influenced by it. Roman literature, art, philosophy, and science were all shaped by Hellenistic Greek models. Roman emperors saw themselves as the successors to Alexander, and many attempted to emulate his conquests. Julius Caesar wept when reading about Alexander, lamenting that at Alexander's age, Caesar had accomplished nothing comparable. Pompey styled himself as a new Alexander and was. Alexander's military tactics and strategic thinking influenced warfare for centuries. The Macedonian phalanx remained the dominant infantry formation until Roman legions defeated it. The combined arms approach, using cavalry, infantry, and light troops in coordinated attacks, became standard military practice. Alexander's use of siege warfare and his willingness to tackle supposedly impregnable fortresses established new standards for what could be accomplished with determination and engineering skill. His practice of leading from the front, sharing his soldiers' hardships, and inspiring loyalty through personal charisma became the model for military leadership. Commanders throughout history studied Alexander's campaigns and tried to learn from his methods. The romantic aspects of Alexander's story ensured that he became a legendary figure almost immediately after his death. The Alexander Romance, a highly fictionalized biography, was composed within a few centuries of his death and was translated into dozens of languages. In this text, Alexander became a symbol of the heroic explorer pushing beyond known boundaries, encountering marvels and wonders, seeking immortality through glorious deeds. Medieval Europeans knew these stories, and Alexander appeared in their literature as one of the 9 worthies, the greatest heroes of history. In the Islamic world, he appears in the Quran as Dhul Qarnayn, the 2-horned one, a righteous king and explorer. Ferdowsi's Persian epic Shahnameh includes Alexander, portraying him as a legitimate Persian king despite his Greek origins. In India, local traditions developed about his encounters with Indian kings and philosophers. Alexander became a universal figure, claimed by multiple cultures and traditions, transformed from a historical person into a mythological symbol. The historical Alexander is harder to assess than the legendary one. He was clearly a military genius, perhaps the most talented tactical commander who ever lived. His ability to assess terrain, to understand enemy intentions, to coordinate different types of troops, and to seize fleeting opportunities in the chaos of battle was extraordinary. He was also courageous to the point of recklessness, inspiring fierce loyalty in his troops by sharing and often exceeding their dangers. His energy and drive were phenomenal, allowing him to campaign continuously for 12 years across thousands of miles of difficult terrain. He had real intellectual curiosity, interest in science and geography, as well as military affairs, and he carried scholars with his army to document his discoveries. His treatment of defeated enemies could be generous, and he showed respect for different cultures and religions more than most ancient conquerors did. But Alexander also had a dark side that became more pronounced as he aged, and as success and power corrupted his character. He could be ruthlessly cruel, massacring civilian populations, selling thousands into slavery, crucifying resistors as warnings. His drinking was excessive, even by Macedonian standards, and led to catastrophic incidents like the murder of Clitus. His quest for glory became increasingly obsessive, driving him to take absurd risks and to push his men beyond reasonable limits. His claim to divine status alienated many of his companions and suggested a dangerous megalomaniac streak. His inability or unwillingness to provide for succession demonstrated a fatal lack of planning and concern for what would happen after his death. The burning of Persepolis, whether deliberate revenge or drunken accident, destroyed irreplaceable cultural heritage. The march through Gedrosia killed thousands of his own troops for no military purpose, except proving it could be done. Historians have debated Alexander's character and significance for millennia, and will continue to debate them. Was he a visionary who wanted to unite humanity and create a fusion of the best elements of different cultures? Or was he simply a conqueror whose talk of fusion was propaganda to justify his rule over conquered peoples? Did he have a master plan for his empire, or was he simply making up policy as he went, reacting to circumstances rather than pursuing a coherent vision? Was his generosity toward defeated enemies genuine magnanimity or calculated strategy? Was he a military leader whose conquests spread civilization, or was he a destroyer who killed hundreds of thousands and disrupted stable societies for his own glory? Different historians give different answers based on which ancient sources they trust, and their own philosophical assumptions about human nature and historical causation. What cannot be denied is Alexander's extraordinary impact on world history. In just 12 years of active campaigning, he conquered the largest empire the world had yet seen, spreading Greek language and culture across 3 continents. He overthrew the Persian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for 2 centuries, and replaced it with a network of Hellenistic kingdoms that would shape the region for centuries. He opened routes of trade and communication between Europe, Asia, and Africa. His cities became centers of commerce and culture. His example inspired imitators and emulators for millennia. The world after Alexander was fundamentally different from the world before him, and much of that change can be traced directly to his decisions and his conquests. Alexander died too young to know whether his empire could be sustained, whether his vision of cultural fusion could work in practice, whether his achievements would last beyond his lifetime. In purely political terms, his empire collapsed immediately, divided among his successors, and never reunited. But in cultural terms, his legacy endured for centuries. The Hellenistic world he created remained the dominant cultural force in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East until the rise of Islam in the 7th century of the Common Era. The Greek language remained the language of educated discourse in the Eastern Roman Empire for 1,000 years after Alexander's death. The cities he founded remained important for centuries, some of them becoming major urban centers that exist to this day. Alexandria in Egypt remained one of the world's great cities for centuries, a beacon of learning and commerce. Herat in Afghanistan, originally Alexandria in Ariana, has been continuously inhabited for more than 2 millennia. Kandahar traces its name to a corruption of Alexander, and traditions about his presence remain alive in the region. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Alexander's legacy is how he became a symbol that transcended his own historical reality. He was the young king who achieved the impossible, who conquered the known world before he was 30, who reached for immortal glory and achieved it. His story became a template for ambition, for the belief that human will and courage can overcome any obstacle, that destiny favors the bold, that greatness requires risk and sacrifice. Every young man who dreamed of glory, from Caesar to Napoleon to countless others whose names history has forgotten, looked to Alexander as the supreme exemplar of what one extraordinary individual could achieve. His example was both inspiring and cautionary, demonstrating the heights human achievement could reach, but also the instability of empires built by force and personality rather than institutions and consent. The tragedy of Alexander is that his very success contained the seeds of failure. He conquered too much too quickly, creating an empire too vast to be governed by the systems and personnel available to him. He lived too intensely, burning himself out in 12 years of constant warfare and leaving no time to build stable institutions or train successors. He inspired such loyalty to himself personally that no one else could command the same devotion from his army, making the empire dependent on his survival. When he died suddenly at 32, everything he had built politically collapsed within months. Only the cultural changes he had initiated proved lasting, and even those were not entirely what he had intended. His dream of a genuine partnership between Greeks and Persians, of a unified empire transcending ethnic divisions, died with him. His successors established kingdoms where Greeks and Macedonians formed a ruling class over native populations, exploiting them economically while preserving their own cultural identity. Yet for all the ways Alexander's political achievements proved transient, the fact remains that he changed the course of human history more decisively than almost any other individual. Before Alexander, the Mediterranean world and the Near East were largely separate civilizations with limited contact. After Alexander, they were permanently connected, their cultures intermingled, their economies integrated, their histories intertwined. Greek philosophy and science spread to Egypt and Mesopotamia, where scholars built upon classical Greek foundations to create new syntheses. Eastern religious ideas and practices spread westward, influencing Greek philosophy and eventually Christianity. The cosmopolitan culture of the Hellenistic world, where educated people from different ethnic backgrounds could communicate in a common language and participate in a shared civilization, was something genuinely new in human history. It was the first truly international culture, and it established patterns that would be repeated by later empires, most notably Rome. Alexander's military campaigns also had unexpected long-term consequences. His expedition opened India to direct Greek contact for the first time, leading to cultural exchange and the emergence of Greco-Buddhist art in Gandhara. Greek-style kingdoms persisted in Bactria and northwestern India for centuries after his death, until they were eventually absorbed by new invasions from Central Asia. But they left traces in the art, coinage, and cultural practices of the region. Some scholars have argued that Buddhist sculpture, which had not previously depicted the Buddha in human form, was influenced by Greek artistic conventions brought by Alexander's successors. The extent of Greek influence on Indian culture remains debated, but that there was substantial contact and some cultural exchange is undeniable. The romanticization of Alexander began almost immediately after his death. His contemporaries, even those who disliked him or who were critical of his policies, acknowledged that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Theophrastus, Aristotle's successor as head of the Lyceum in Athens, received reports from Alexander's expedition and used them in his botanical and geographical studies. Ptolemy, who became king of Egypt, wrote a history of Alexander's campaigns that became the basis for later accounts. These early writers established the basic narrative of Alexander's life, emphasizing his courage, his tactical genius, his generosity to defeated enemies, and his quest to reach the ends of the earth. They also preserved stories of his flaws, his drinking, his rages, his increasingly despotic behavior. But even in criticizing him, they reinforced the sense that Alexander was extraordinary, that his achievements exceeded normal human capacity. Later writers embellished the basic story with legendary elements. The Alexander Romance, composed by an unknown author sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, transformed Alexander from a historical figure into a mythical hero. In this text, Alexander is the son of an Egyptian magician pharaoh rather than Philip of Macedon, giving him more exotic origins. He encounters Amazons, men with dogs' heads, and other marvels. He explores the ocean depths in a glass diving bell. He attempts to fly to the heavens using griffins harnessed to his throne. He searches for the fountain of youth and the pillars that hold up the sky. These fantastic adventures had little to do with the historical Alexander, but demonstrated his transformation into a symbol of human curiosity and ambition, the eternal quester seeking to transcend human limitations. The medieval world inherited both the historical and legendary Alexander. Christian writers were ambivalent about him. On one hand, he was a pagan who worshipped false gods and who claimed divine status for himself. On the other hand, he could be interpreted as an instrument of divine providence, spreading Greek civilization that would provide the cultural foundation for Christianity. The New Testament was written in Greek, the common language that Alexander's conquests had spread. Christian theology drew heavily on Greek philosophy, particularly Platonic and Stoic ideas that had been preserved and developed in the Hellenistic world Alexander created. Without Alexander's unification of the Mediterranean world and the spread of Greek language and culture, Christianity might have remained a small Jewish sect rather than becoming a world religion. Medieval Christian writers thus often portrayed Alexander positively as a great king who prepared the way for the gospel. Islamic traditions also claimed Alexander. The Quran's mention of Dhul Qarnayn, a righteous king who built a wall to protect people from destructive tribes, was interpreted by many commentators as referring to Alexander. This identification was not universally accepted, but it allowed Muslim writers to develop their own Alexander traditions, portraying him as a believer in the one true God and a wise king who protected the weak from the strong. Persian writers, despite Alexander having conquered and burned Persepolis, eventually incorporated him into Persian literature and legend. In Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, Alexander is presented as the son of a Persian princess and thus half Persian by blood, legitimizing his rule over Iran and allowing him to be claimed as part of Persian rather than purely Greek heritage. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical learning brought renewed attention to the historical Alexander. Scholars studied the ancient historians, Plutarch, Arrian, Curtius Rufus, and Diodorus, attempting to reconstruct what actually happened rather than accepting medieval legends. Alexander became a model for Renaissance princes and condottieri, demonstrating how individual genius and audacity could transform the political map. Machiavelli discussed Alexander in The Prince, using him as an example of different aspects of political leadership. Artists depicted scenes from Alexander's life: the taming of Bucephalus, the cutting of the Gordian knot, the battle of Issus, the meeting with Diogenes. Alexander became a standard figure in Western art and literature, instantly recognizable and loaded with symbolic meaning. The age of European colonial expansion brought new interest in Alexander's conquests as the precedent for European imperialism in Asia. British officers in India read accounts of Alexander's campaigns and visited sites associated with his passage. They saw themselves as following in his footsteps, bringing Western civilization to the East, just as he had brought Greek culture to Persia and India. This imperialist interpretation of Alexander emphasized his role as a civilizing force, spreading enlightenment to backward peoples. It downplayed or ignored the violence of his conquests, the destruction he caused, the peoples he enslaved or massacred. Alexander became a symbol of the white man's burden, the supposed duty of superior Western civilization to rule and improve inferior Eastern societies. Modern scholarship has taken a more critical view. 20th and 21st century historians have emphasized the brutality of Alexander's campaigns, the enormous casualties his wars caused, the destabilization of regions that had been relatively peaceful under Persian rule. They have questioned whether the spread of Greek culture justified the violence required to spread it, whether the cities Alexander founded benefited local populations, or primarily served as instruments of foreign control, whether Alexander's vision of cultural fusion was genuine or merely propaganda to legitimize conquest. Post-colonial scholars have particularly criticized the heroic narrative of Alexander, seeing it as a justification for imperialism and as dismissive of the agency and achievements of the peoples he conquered. From this perspective, Alexander was not a bringer of civilization, but an aggressor who destroyed functioning societies to satisfy his own ambition for glory. The historical truth is probably that Alexander was neither the pure hero of legend nor the simple villain of anti-imperialist critique. He was a product of his time and culture, shaped by Macedonian warrior values, Greek education, and the opportunities created by his father's achievements. He had extraordinary talents as a military commander and could inspire intense loyalty. He also had serious character flaws that worsened with age and success, particularly his drinking, his violent temper, and his growing megalomaniac tendencies. His policies toward conquered peoples mixed genuine cultural curiosity and respect with brutal violence and exploitation. His vision of a unified empire transcending ethnic divisions was ahead of its time, but was never fully realized and did not survive his death. His conquests spread Greek culture widely, but also caused enormous suffering and disrupted established societies. What we can say definitively is that Alexander's life was one of the most consequential in human history. He lived for only 32 years, but in that short span, he conquered more territory than anyone before him, spread Greek civilization across 3 continents, overthrew the Persian Empire, and created a new cosmopolitan world that would shape subsequent centuries. He demonstrated what human will and ability could achieve when pushed to their limits. He also demonstrated the limitations of individual achievement, how even the most brilliant conquests could not create lasting political stability without institutions and consensus. His life raises fundamental questions about the nature of greatness, the costs of ambition, the relationship between civilization and violence, and the role of individuals in shaping history. Every generation recreates Alexander according to its own values and concerns. The Alexander that medieval Christians knew was different from the Alexander of Renaissance princes, who was different from the Alexander of 19th century imperialists, who is different from the Alexander of contemporary scholarship. This malleability is itself a form of immortality. Alexander achieved his goal of eternal glory, but that glory is not static. Each age sees different aspects of his life and legacy as most relevant and most worthy of emulation or condemnation. The conversations about Alexander, the debates over his significance, the conflicting interpretations of his motives and achievements, all testify to his enduring importance. More than 2,000 years after his death, we still grapple with the questions his life raises about power, ambition, cultural exchange, and the price of glory. In the final analysis, Alexander the Great remains one of history's most complex and fascinating figures. He was the young king who conquered the known world, the student of Aristotle who burned Persepolis, the military genius who died young, leaving his empire to collapse, the Macedonian warrior who tried to unite Greeks and Persians, the seeker of glory who achieved immortal fame at terrible cost. He was brilliant and ruthless, generous and cruel, visionary and reckless, a man of extraordinary talents and serious flaws. His conquests changed the world forever, spreading Greek civilization across vast territories and creating the Hellenistic culture that would bridge the ancient and medieval worlds. His political achievements proved ephemeral, his empire fragmenting immediately after his death. But his cultural legacy endured for centuries, and his legend has lasted for millennia. As we look back across the centuries at this young king who died in Babylon in 323 before the Common Era, we see both the historical person and the legend he became. We see the child born to Philip and Olympias, the student of Aristotle, the tamer of Bucephalus, the young warrior at Chaeronea, the mourner at Troy, the victor at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, the explorer who reached India, the grieving friend who lost Hephaestion, the dying king who could only gesture farewell to his soldiers. We see also the symbol he became, the eternal quester, the young hero who achieved the impossible, the mortal who reached for divinity. We see the civilizer and the destroyer, the visionary and the tyrant, the genius and the flawed human being. Alexander the Great, king of Macedonia, pharaoh of Egypt, great king of Persia, lord of Asia, remains after all these centuries what he was in life. Impossible to categorize simply, too large for any single interpretation, forever fascinating and forever controversial. The man who more than almost any other individual shaped the ancient world and whose legacy still echoes in our own time.